Hello crafty friends, I'm Lien from Studio Cato and I'm so glad you're joining me again today. For today's card I did some masking and some no-line coloring with colored pencils to create this adorable little scene. I started out by die cutting the Doily lace frame die by Mama Elephant, one's from cream cardstock and one's from Neenah Desert Storm cardstock. I'm using images from the My Pet Kitties and the Dandelion Wishes stamp sets. And I'm stamping those onto a full stick post-it note to create some masks. I'm using Memento Tuxedo Black because that dries pretty quickly. I'm fussy cutting out these images and I will be using them not just to stamp this one layer scene, but also to mask off the images at the end when I do some ink blending. It did take me a while to cut all these out, but the good news is it doesn't have to be precise. Now to stamp out the scene, I am using my Misti, so I have time to fiddle around with the images and make sure I'm happy with the placement before anything is stamped down. I am stamping all these images out in InkOn3 Fade Out Ink, which is perfect for no-line coloring. Now when you're doing a one-layer scene with masking, it's important which images to stamp first. Everything that is in the foreground needs to be stamped first. Then you can place the masks on top and stamp anything that needs to be behind those images. So when you're creating a one-layer scene with masking, you're working from the front all the way to the back of the scene. It took me quite a while to figure out the placement of these flowers. And just a side note, I am stamping everything twice in my Misti because this InkOn3 Fade Out ink is really light, and just to make it a little bit more easy to see, I am double stamping all the images. I am using my colored pencils to color in this scene. These are the Faber-Castell Polychromos pencils, and I really like how vibrant the colors are. To color everything in, I am making sure my pencils are all very sharp. The jump cuts you see in the coloring is me sharpening my pencils. I'm also taking my time with this. It took me a little over an hour to color everything in. When working with colored pencils, I always go from the darkest to the lightest color in each image. This is a personal preference. I just find this way easier to blend everything out nicely. When there are tiny details to an image, like the facial features of this little kitten, I always trace over those first with my darkest color. When you do this with colored pencils, you do have to be a little careful about coloring over those features, because you could smudge them a little bit with a different color. Now, as I said, I am working from dark to light, but to get a smooth, even blend, I always go back to the medium shade after I did my lightest color, and sometimes even to the darkest shade. I always work in layers when I color. This may be because I'm so used to coloring everything in watercolor, but it works for colored pencils as well, and even for alcohol markers. When you work in layers, you can really add depth to the shadows, and this is especially important in no-line coloring. What makes or breaks a no-line coloring scene is the contrast between the dark and light. There is no outline to define your image, so you really have to work with the shadows to do that instead. Now, as you might be able to tell here, my images are slowly but surely fading out, just as the ink promised. Of course, it's not easy to color in an invisible image, so it's always helpful to keep the stamp set nearby so you can refer to that. This mouse was pretty much invisible to me at this point, which is why I kept looking at the stamp to see how the image should look. You also don't have to stick to the image perfectly. The leaves on my dandelions are way bigger than they should be according to the stamp set. Once I was done coloring those leaves, I added in some detail again using a dark brown pencil. I prefer to use dark brown for this, just as I did on the kitten's features, because I find black details very harsh in a no-line coloring scene. For the fluffy dandelions, I am using some blue right in the middle and then fading that out into white. I chose to use purple for the butterfly because it contrasts nicely with the orange of the cat. Now I'm putting my masks in place again, mostly for the critters, because I will be doing some ink blending to finish this scene. I used a grass border die from the Mama Elephant Slim window dressing die set to create a stencil to do my grass on this scene. I'm using Distress Oxide inks in the colors Shabby Shutter, Mowed Lawn, and for the sky I'm using Tumbled Glass and Mermaid Lagoon. I love how these inks seem to glow on craft cardstock. And now the magical reveal when you can peel away the masks. I'm adding some really simple details to the grass with a green pencil. And then I'm adding some drop shadows. The drop shadows here are really subtle. I darkened them up later after I stopped filming, so you will see that in the end product, but I completely forgot to turn on my camera for that. I added some details in white gel pen, and that pretty much finishes it. Now for my sentiment. I'm using a sentiment from the Dandelion Wishes stamp set and stamping that in Versamark ink. I'm embossing it with Wow Bright White Superfine embossing powder. Now as you see, I cut a really small note card which will fit just behind the border of that frame. I'm gluing that onto the frame, and then I can glue my scene in the middle. That finishes up the card, and as you can see, I can still stand it up to display it. Now I thought it would be nice to show you a really quick idea for a matching envelope. I am just following the instructions on my 123 punch board by We Are Memory Keepers to make a craft A2 size envelope. I'm scoring and folding everything nicely, but I'm not adhering anything quite yet. I then put that in my Misti, and I'll just stamp a couple of images that I used in the scene in Versamark ink. Now I want to do masking here, so I heat set the first image before I stamped the second one. I can now stamp the toadstools and sprinkle on the embossing powder. Then I will take away the mask and heat set that again. I'm adding some glue to the envelope to seal it. And that's it. I really like how this card turned out, and I hope you liked the video. In the description below you can find a link to my Instagram, my blog post, and a list of supplies. I hope you leave a comment letting me know your thoughts on this video, and that you subscribe to stay tuned for more. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.